Happy to present Dr. Julia Simner. She is the professor of neuropsychology and the director of the Multi-Sense Lab in Sussex at Sussex University. And she's going to present misophonia, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. All right, Jules, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. Let me know if there's any problems with the slides, because I can't see you anymore. So I want to begin with a trigger warning, because I'll be talking about some pretty difficult topics of self-harm and suicidal thinking. And for the same reason, I want to tell you upfront what we found. We found significantly higher risks of these things in people with misophonia. And that might be alarming to you if you have misophonia or if you're a parent. But I want to tell you what that word significant means, because a significant risk means something quite different to a scientist than what you might think. So, in everyday language, a significant risk means a substantial risk, right? A really big risk. But scientists use the word significant in a different way. For scientists, it simply means that we ran a statistical analysis and we can trust the numbers. So a significant risk means there is some type of risk, whether it's big or small. So I didn't want to alarm you by making you think these are all huge risks or that it's definitely going to happen. These aren't, and it's not. So, please do understand that context. And finally, I hope you can take these findings as showing us that knowledge really is power. And if we understand the risks between misophonia and self-harm, we can do so much more to tackle it. So let me turn now to my talk. So who are we? We're a group of scientists at University of Sussex. We're psychologists, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists and sound engineers, and we come together to study misophonia. And you can see we're on the south coast of the United Kingdom. This is our lovely campus. This is our lovely town. And we also host the Misophonia Hub. And what we really do, and I'll tell you more about that, but what we really do is three different things. So first of all, we support people with misophonia. And we do that via the Misophonia Hub, which is really a portal where we channel lots of information about misophonia. And so, for example, if you're on our website and you press these two buttons, you can get downloadable fact sheets. You can download a fact sheet about misophonia and give it to your child's teacher, or an adult misophonia fact sheet, and you can give it to your family doctor or your university support office and so on. And if you press this button, this is the second thing we do. We're very interested in making diagnostics, especially for children. So if you press this button, you can take a test, and some of the tests are for adults written in words and some are for children written in pictures. And the third thing we do is research, and this is really mainly what we do. So we run science and then we write up our science into research articles, and we've been doing that for for about 4 or 5 years now. So this is the latest science that I'd like to talk to you about today. So my questions for today are people with misophonia more likely to self-harm? Do people with misophonia have more thoughts of suicide? Do they have poorer well-being at the same age? And there's a special focus we have on adolescents and young adults. And, are there any gender effects? And I'm just going to apologize immediately, because the data that we had only shows sex at birth, so it doesn't contain any information about self-identification. So apologies for that. But so what is it we're talking about? Well, what is self-harm, suicidal thought? Certainly a key public health concern, because by the age of 17 years, European adolescents, 17% of them have already attempted some form of self-harm, and that might be in the form of cutting, or it might be punching a wall, or but 17% is a hefty number. And self-harm, there are two types that we consider, which is self-harm with intent to die, and we might think of that as attempted suicide, but also self-harm without suicidal intent, so non-suicidal self-injury. And then there are the related concepts of suicidal thinking or planning as well. So what did we know about these things in misophonia before our study? Well, one thing we certainly knew is that misophonia brings poorer welfare. So we have a bunch of papers, and they showed that in children and adolescents, those with misophonia have poorer well-being from the age of 10 onwards, at least. They have lower satisfaction with life. They have stronger negative emotional reactivity. That means that they feel negative emotions sooner, deeper, and for longer than children without misophonia. They have sensory sensitivities across multiple senses, as we saw before in Jamie's talk. They have significantly more anxiety from the age of 7, depression from 9. They have higher autistic traits and systemizing traits, and also higher traits of obsessive compulsive disorder. So why does that matter? Well, these co-occurring traits increase the risk of self-harm. We know that depression increases the risk of self-harm by 5 times over, and that autism increases self-harm by 3 times over. So, you know, misophonia brings poorer welfare, and this poor welfare is linked to self-harm. So, but was there any direct evidence of misophonia and self-harm before our study? Not really. There was no clear direct evidence for self-harm in misophonia. There were studies that had looked at it. There were 2 types of studies. There were case studies and group studies. Now, case studies are when a scientist writes a report about one person. And there were 4 of these about misophonia. So 4 of these reports about someone with misophonia who also had self-harmed or had suicidal thoughts. But the thing about case studies, they're useful, but they can't show cause. Because that one person who had misophonia and self-harm, that could have been a fluke. That could have been unrelated. You know, and to tell you what I mean by that, I'll tell you about quite a famous case study, which is by Blom et al. In 2014. And they had a case study of a person who had depression, but also saw dragons everywhere, hallucinated dragons, and saw people morph into dragons. But, you know, clearly those things aren't causally related. We don't think that everyone with depression is going to see dragons everywhere. So, you know, that's one limitation with case studies. There were a couple of group studies. 2 of them had shown suicidality in normal range. So there was no control group, but the levels of suicidality in people with misophonia was what you might expect in the general population. But one study had shown that people with misophonia had self-reported more suicide attempts. Okay, so that was really important to explore further. The problem with that study is that they'd had many, many dropouts. Hundreds and hundreds of people had dropped out of that study. And it wasn't clear whether the ones who dropped out were the ones who didn't self-harm. And so we couldn't really tell whether there was a proper causal link there. So that's where we came in. So what did we do? Well, we started by screening 4,166 adults for misophonia. They were all 30 years old. We screened every single one for misophonia, and we just found who the people with misophonia were in that group. We found 375 had misophonia, and the rest did not. So the 3,791 who did not have misophonia, we're going to call those the controls, okay? So then we wanted to know, well, do these people with misophonia, these 375, do they self-harm more? And the way we were able to ask that question was because these 4,000 odd participants were very, very special. They all came from something called the Children of the 90s cohort. And the Children of the 90s cohort is a really special group of adults who've been extensively tested throughout their entire life, as far back as when they were in the womb. So this very forward-thinking professor in the 1990s recruited thousands and thousands and thousands of pregnant women, gave them a whole battery of tests to assess their physical and mental well-being. And then when their babies were born, they tested the babies. And as the babies grew up, they tested them when they were children, when they were adolescents, when they were young adults. And now those babies are 30 odd. They're in their early 30s. And we came in when they were 30 years old and we screened every single one of them for misophonia. So now we know in this amazing cohort who the misophonics are. So the question is, did they self-harm as adolescents? And we can ask that question because we can reach back into their past. So here's a baby from the study, baby's now 30 odd, but what we can do is look back at the questionnaires they completed when they were 16, and again when they were around in their early 20s. We can reach back into their past, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at them when we looked at the questionnaires they'd completed on self-harm and well-being when they were 16 and 24. And of course, we didn't just look at the boys, we also looked at the girls. So at 16 and 24, the questionnaires they'd filled out were 2 types. There were well-being questionnaires and there were self-harm and suicidal thinking questionnaires. So there were 4 different well-being questionnaires, and I've just written what they're called here. But they have questions that you have to rate on a scale of 1 to 7. So, rating on a scale of 1 to 7, do you feel optimistic about the future? How much do you consider yourself to be a happy person? And so on. Okay, so we have scores on all these wellbeing questionnaires. And we also had a very short self-harm and suicidal thinking questionnaire. And these were the questions it asked. Have you ever felt that life was not worth living? Have you ever thought of killing yourself, even if you wouldn't really do it? Have you ever hurt yourself on purpose in any way? And when you did you seriously want to kill yourself? So what did we find? Well, first of all, looking at well-being, the first thing we found is that men and women mostly had the same well-being, mostly in 3 out of 4 of the questionnaires. When they didn't, it was the women who had poorer well-being, okay, in one of the questionnaires. And that's what we know already. We expect to find that because we know that female well-being dips from teenage years onwards. So no surprises there. But what was really important is that we found that the misophonics had poorer well-being in every scale at every age. So when we looked at those 375 people with misophonia, they scored lower in well-being. And I'm just going to show you an example of the data, and I'm going to help you to understand this figure. So the first thing I want you to look at are these 2 solid bars, which are the men and the women without misophonia, the controls. Okay, and they're pretty happy when they subjectively rate their happiness. They're pretty happy. But if we now look at the people with misophonia, you can see that their happiness is lower. Okay, their self-rated happiness is significantly lower. And that was true on every scale at every age. In terms of suicidal thinking, remember they were asked, have you ever felt that life was not worth living or thought of killing yourself? And we looked at the men and women separately, and here's what we found. So for women, we found that those with misophonia had more suicidal feeling than controls, both at age 16 and 24. So this sort of mottled pink bar are the women with misophonia, and this solid red bar are the controls, the women without misophonia. And at both age 16 and age 24, a higher percentage of those with misophonia had suicidal feelings. For men, the misophonia made no difference. Okay? The misophonics were the same as the controls. Now, when we look at self-harm, we found exactly the same pattern for women. It's almost exactly the same graph, right? And we found that women with misophonia had self-harmed more than the females without misophonia. Okay, and it's almost exactly the same graph. You can see a higher percentage again. And don't forget, this is quite a high percentage, but this is everything ranging from punching a wall to, serious self-harm and cutting. Now here for men, we found that misophonia again made no difference at 16, but it did by the age of 24. By the age of 24, men with misophonia self-harmed more than the controls, more than the men without misophonia. Okay, and this is the graph, and you can see that difference here. This mottled bar are the men with misophonia, and a higher percentage of self-harming compared to their controls at 24. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about suicide attempt. The question here was, when you did self-harm, for those who did you seriously want to kill yourself? And we found that for women at the age of 24, those with misophonia had indeed self-harmed with intent to die more than controls. Okay, we found a higher percentage. I just want to qualify this. I had called this suicide attempt, but actually this is quite a high proportion, and I don't think this question really taps into suicide attempt. What I think it means is that, yes, if you self-harmed, you might have been thinking about killing yourself, but it's not the same as saying, did you actively try to kill yourself at that moment? So, there are worrying signs, but I think maybe it's too strong to say that this is suicide attempt proper. What did we find in men? We found that misophonia made no difference. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that there are higher risks of self-harm and suicidal thought in misophonia from the age of 16 at least. And we've found that misophonics who are female are particularly at risk. They had more suicidal feelings at 16 and 24 than women without misophonia. They had more suicidal self-harm by 24 than those without misophonia. And they had more suicidal self-harm more non-suicidal self-harm at 16 and 24. But by the way, the men were catching up at 24. The male misophonics were self-harming more than controls. Okay. And they also people with misophonia also had poorer well-being at the same ages, as you might expect. So my one very large conclusion from this is that we need greater recognition and treatment pathways for people with misophonia. We need clinicians to know that if someone comes to you and they have misophonia, they do have this elevated risk of self-harm and suicidal thoughts. There are limitations in our study, of course. So the biggest limitation is that misophonia is tied up with anxiety and depression. So which one of those is the cause? What we're doing now is we're teasing it apart. We're trying to find out whether people with misophonia were self-harming more simply because more of them had anxiety or because more of them had depression, or whether there's an individual contribution of misophonia itself. You know, it's still valuable information because clinicians need to know that someone presenting with misophonia has this elevated risk, and that's why we ran the first study. The second limitation is, you know, our study is about the past to some extent. People were filling out these questionnaires in 2006 to 14. So, you know, have things changed? Maybe things have changed. But that's our results. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you especially to my colleague, Dr. Louisa Rinaldi, who was instrumental in doing this research with me. And I'll leave you with a thanks and the link to the Misophonia Hub. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simner. Now we're going to have some questions that are coming in. I think it was a really, really meaningful presentation. Take a look if we have some questions. Well, I'm going to start with a question while people are starting to write. Is there, using this Children of the 90s data, are there other attributes and traits and issues that you can now go back and look at as well? And if so, what would you do if you haven't already?
Yeah, it's a really, really valuable cohort. It's astonishing. It has literally millions of data points. I think it has 75,000 different variables. It has everything from, well, at the moment, we're hoping to get funding for some research that looks at misophonia in schools. Because if you think about it, but we don't know much about childhood misophonia, but children spend most of their waking life at school, and schools are filled with, you know, misophonic triggers of, you know, there's chewing in the canteen, there's clock ticking in the exam rooms, and there's, you know, coughing in classrooms. And so one thing we're doing is we're looking at we want to look at school attendance, satisfaction with school, academic attainment at school, cognitive skills that lead to academic attainment, like short-term memory. It's such a beautiful wealth of data. And we can even jump right back to the mother when she was pregnant. So we have another research project which we'd like to fund, which is called Mother, Baby, Fetus, Child. Mother, fetus, baby, child. And we looked at the mother, and we can look at the mothers of the misophonics. Were they more anxious during, there's no blame here, but maybe they themselves were experiencing anxiety. We can look at whether the babies at the age of 1 were extra restless. You know, maybe they had more difficulty feeding, maybe they had more difficulty being held. So, I mean, I could go on and on. It's an amazing resource. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr. Simner, would you mind stopping your screen share? Some people are getting feedback. Sorry.